Ford's legacy is packed with legendary cars, but hidden among them are some of the most dangerously wild rides ever made. These weren't just fast or flashy, they were reckless, unstable, or downright unsafe machines that somehow made it to production. From cars with terrifying handling to models prone to mechanical failure, Ford's history includes vehicles that tested the limits of driver and machine alike. Ah yes, the 1966 Ford GT40 Mach road car, a machine so steeped in legend that even its name sounds like a victory cry. It was forged not in the soft-focus world of automotive luxury, but in the brutal crucible of endurance racing, designed with a singular, relentless purpose: to crush Ferrari at Le Mans. And it did, spectacularly. But what few people talk about, and what even fewer truly understand, is that the road-going GT40 wasn't some watered-down celebration of that triumph. No, it was the monster itself, barely leashed, reluctantly handed over to the road with the same violent heart and savage temperament that once tore up the Mulsanne straight at 200 miles per hour. This was not a grand tourer. It was not a comfortable weekend cruiser. It was a barely tamed predator that snarled in your garage, waiting to bite. From the moment you approached it, you knew you were dealing with something different. The car sat impossibly low, just 40 inches to the top of the roof, hence the name, and you didn't so much enter it as you descended into it. Getting in was a ritual. Open the long, cut into the roof doors, swing your legs over the massive sill, and drop into a seat that felt more like a carbon fiber foxhole than a bucket. Your feet pointed off at an angle. The steering wheel was huge and unforgiving. The pedals so close together, they seemed designed for ballet dancers. You didn't adjust to the GT40. You submitted to it. Then came the ignition. You turned the key, and the 289 cubic inch V8, a race-prepped, snarling lump of iron mounted inches behind your head, exploded into life with a sound that was less mechanical and more primal. There was no insulation to muffle the fury, no padding to soften the shriek. Every vibration, every combustion cycle, every ounce of fury surged directly through the car and into your bones. It shook your rib cage. It roared like a war drum, and it never ever calmed down. The throttle was a hair trigger. A mere brush of your foot could send the rear tires scrambling for grip, even in second gear. Torque came on in a wave, hard and sudden, with no electronic safety nets to catch you. This wasn't a car you drove casually. This was a car that demanded respect, demanded skill, and demanded your full attention. The margin for error? It didn't exist. This was a car that punished hesitation and rewarded courage, but only if your reflexes were sharp and your nerve was stronger than your fear. And dear God, the heat. No one tells you about the heat. The engine sat just behind your shoulders, separated from the cabin by a thin sheet of aluminum that might as well have been foil. After 15 minutes in traffic, your back would be soaked, your legs would feel like they were broiling, and the cabin would fill with the raw, metallic scent of racing oil and hot electronics. Forget air conditioning. There was none. The tiny sliding window in the Lexan side panels offered barely a whisper of breeze. Ventilation? Try opening your mouth and praying. Visibility? A joke. You couldn't see out the back. You could barely see out the front. The windshield was small and low, the mirrors laughably tiny. Backing out of a driveway was like navigating a submarine through a minefield. Every motion behind the wheel was a calculated risk. You didn't drive a GT40 so much as wrestle it, like you were trying to tame a dragon with nothing but a leather glove and your own stubborn pride. But when the road opened up, when the noise and the fear and the heat all faded into the roar of the engine and the blur of scenery flying past you, that's when the GT40 made sense. It was a creature of speed, a thing of glorious, unrelenting purpose. It cornered like a scalpel, braked like a parachute, and surged forward with the kind of force that made the horizon feel dangerously close. In those moments, with the world narrowing to a tunnel of motion and engine noise, the GT40 was transcendent, not safe, not comfortable, but pure. Yet even in those peak moments, there was always a shadow of danger. A wrong gear change could destroy your transmission. A missed brake point could send you spinning into a ditch. It didn't matter that it wore license plates. The GT40 never pretended to be a street car. It was a race car that had briefly escaped its paddock. It was a lion in a dinner jacket, and the jacket didn't fit. Ford only built a handful of Mach road cars, and today they sit in collections like holy relics. But those who've driven them, really driven them, speak of the experience in reverent, slightly shaken tones. One former owner once said, "It was the only car I've ever had that I was afraid to drive alone. Not because of reliability, not because of fame, but because every single time he turned that key, he wasn't sure if he'd make it home." The GT40 Mach road car was a street-legal race car in only the loosest sense. The 1991 Ford Explorer. At first glance, it was the future, the sleek, upright symbol of a new American lifestyle. Gone were the bossy wagons and sluggish sedans of the 80s. The Explorer was bold, versatile, adventurous. It was the official vehicle of weekend camping trips, suburban soccer practice, and the open road. It practically invented the modern SUV craze. And yet, beneath its family-friendly image and glossy brochures lurked a tragic and avoidable engineering failure, one that would eventually become one of the most infamous automotive safety scandals of the late 20th century. The original Explorer was launched with high hopes and tremendous fanfare. It promised comfort, capability, and the high-riding security of a truck without the harshness of a pickup. Built on the bones of the Ford Ranger, it had a solid rear axle, leaf springs, a tall center of gravity, and, in theory, enough rugged charm to take the kids to school and then head off into the mountains. It was an immediate hit. Americans loved it. It felt powerful, confident, and practical. It offered something new, a bridge between the family car and the off-roader. But that bridge, it turns out, had cracks. From the beginning, the Explorer had a geometry problem. Its high ride height, narrow track width, and softly tuned suspension made it prone to instability under extreme conditions. Corner too quickly or swerve at speed, and the tall body could shift dangerously. And while most drivers might never notice this in ordinary use, Ford was quietly walking a tightrope, hoping their engineering compromises wouldn't come back to haunt them. Enter the tires. The Explorer was shipped from the factory with Firestone Wilderness tires, a trusted American brand and a longtime Ford partner. But somewhere between cost-cutting, poor design, and a failure to acknowledge engineering limitations, disaster began to brew. These tires were prone to tread separation, especially when driving at highway speeds in hot climates. Add to that Ford's controversial decision to recommend an unusually low tire pressure, 26 psi, to soften the ride and reduce rollover risk on paper, and you had a deadly cocktail: underinflated tires, a top-heavy SUV, and real-world driving stress. Then the accidents started, and they didn't stop. Blowouts, rollovers, fatal crashes, high-speed loss of control. Reports started pouring in, first in ones and twos, then dozens, then hundreds. In some cases, the tread peeled off the tire like skin off an orange, triggering catastrophic rollovers. Entire families were wiped out in an instant. Survivors described watching their cars flip like coins across the interstate. Over 270 deaths were eventually linked to these failures. Thousands more were injured. For years, the cause was murky, buried under internal documents, blame shifting, and silence. By the late 1990s, the scandal exploded into the public eye. Congressional hearings, class action lawsuits, and whistleblower testimonies turned the Ford-Firestone partnership, once one of the most trusted alliances in Detroit, into a legal and moral battleground. Firestone claimed Ford recommended dangerously low tire pressures to mask the Explorer's rollover risk. Ford pointed the finger back, insisting the tires themselves were defective. In truth, both were right, and both were guilty. The public's confidence was shattered. These weren't high-performance sports cars crashing on mountain roads. These were family vehicles flipping during routine commutes. The trust that had fueled the SUV revolution evaporated overnight. Ford spent billions on recalls and reputation repair. Firestone's name, once synonymous with American craftsmanship, was dragged through the mud. The companies eventually ended their century-long partnership, and the damage was done. The 1991 Ford Explorer is now remembered in two separate voices. On one hand, it was a cultural milestone, the SUV that changed the American car landscape forever. It introduced millions to a new kind of freedom and utility. But on the other, darker hand, it represents one of the greatest betrayals of consumer trust in automotive history. A vehicle that sold safety and confidence, but delivered instability and death. And what's perhaps most haunting of all? The warning signs were there. In the test data, in the internal memos, in the tire factory records, all quietly ignored or dismissed. It wasn't just a failure of engineering. It was a failure of responsibility. Today, the first-generation Explorer might look like just another aging SUV, forgotten in backlots and Craigslist ads. But its legacy is carved in rubber, steel, and courtroom transcripts. It stands as both a pioneer and a cautionary tale, a reminder that when design compromises meet corporate silence, it's the people behind the wheel who pay the price. The 1955 Ford Thunderbird, a name spoken in soft reverence by collectors and dreamers alike. It was a sensation when it debuted, a sleek, low-slung two-seater that promised glamour, freedom, and a hint of speed without the brutish aggression of a Corvette. It was America's idea of elegance on wheels, a personal car aimed at drivers who wanted luxury with a sporty flair. It looked like a dream gliding down the boulevard. White walls, chrome flashing like jewelry, and that long, graceful hood stretching toward the horizon. But behind the romance and the marketing magic, the original T-Bird hid a darker truth, one that very few buyers understood until it was too late. This was a time before seatbelts were standard, before crash testing was a science, before Ralph Nader wrote "unsafe at any speed." And the Thunderbird, as beautiful as it was, emerged from a design philosophy that viewed safety as an afterthought. The 55 T-Bird was never meant to protect you. It was meant to impress you. Slide behind the wheel and you're surrounded by a sea of polished metal and padded vinyl. Except there wasn't much padding. The dashboard, a solid wall of steel. The steering column, long, rigid, and completely non-collapsible. In the event of a frontal collision, that steering shaft turned into a spear, aimed right at the driver's chest. The doors and frame, stiff but unreinforced, with no side impact structure, no engineered deformation zones. The idea of crumple zones hadn't yet filtered into Detroit's design language. If you hit something hard, the Thunderbird didn't absorb the impact. You did. And don't bother looking for seatbelts in the earliest models. Ford didn't include diaphragm, some say it was cost. Others claim marketing didn't want to suggest that driving a Thunderbird could ever be dangerous. Whatever the reason, buyers in 1955 were left defenseless in the face of even modest crashes. A head-on impact at 35 mph could turn a stylish Sunday drive into a fatal encounter with the steering wheel, the dashboard, or even the windshield, which, by the way, was made of tempered glass that shattered into vicious shards, not the safer laminated kind. Underneath its polished skin, the Thunderbird was built on a shortened Ford sedan chassis, solid rear axle, body-on-frame construction, and a ride that was more plush than precise. It wasn't a sports car by European standards. It was a cruiser, a showpiece, a machine designed for admiring glances and Sunday afternoons. Performance wasn't the focus, though with its 292 cubic inch V8 and optional overdrive transmission, it wasn't slow. It could do 0-60 in about 11 seconds, and on the open road it felt powerful, composed, even majestic. But none of that mattered in a crash. The very things that made the Thunderbird feel solid, the thick metal doors, the rigid frame, the heavy steering gear, became deadly liabilities. There was no energy absorption, no cabin protection, no way to keep your body from flying forward if something went wrong. The same chrome trim that sparkled under the sun could become a slicing hazard in a rollover. And yet people adored it. They called it a dreamboat, a boulevardier, a Hollywood car for the masses. Celebrities drove them. Middle-class Americans fantasized about them. It was the perfect symbol of mid-1950s optimism, a rolling declaration that life was good and danger was far away. Safety concerns? Not in the script. Ford would later respond to growing public awareness of vehicle safety by adding seatbelts as optional, and then eventually standard equipment. But by then, the early Thunderbirds were already icons. Few people wanted to talk about what happened when they crashed. The survivors stayed quiet. The cars that didn't survive were towed away, written off, and forgotten. Today, when you see a '55 Thunderbird gleaming at a car show, it's easy to be seduced by its curves, its tail fins, its rakish stance and convertible roof. It's a time machine to a post-war America flush with confidence and chrome. But know this, for all its style, for all its nostalgic beauty, the original Thunderbird was a missile in a velvet wrapper. In an era when cars were sold on style, not survival, the Thunderbird gave drivers what they thought they wanted, and absolutely none of what they truly needed when it all went wrong. It was a symbol of freedom, yes, but freedom without restraint, without protection, and in the end, without mercy. The 1976 Ford Mustang II Cobra II, a car that promised muscle but delivered masquerade. Dressed to kill but built to surrender, this was the kind of machine that looked fast, standing still and dead last in motion. At a glance, it seemed like a resurrection of glory. Racing stripes, hood scoop, rear spoiler, Cobra lettering screaming across the flanks. It wore its disguise with pride, a costume of performance, meant to stir memories of the Boss 429 and 428 Mach 1. But underneath that loud paint and attitude, the Cobra II was not a predator. It was prey. By 1976, the American muscle car was on life support. Emissions regulations, gas crises, rising insurance premiums, they had all conspired to neuter an entire generation of V8 beasts. The original Mustang had grown bloated and soft by the early 70s, so Ford hit the reset button in '74 and delivered the Mustang II, smaller, lighter, more fuel efficient, but also slower, weaker, and, as history would soon reveal, alarmingly unsafe. The Cobra II trim was a desperate attempt to reignite excitement in this fading icon. But most buyers were in for a rude awakening. The Cobra name evoked images of Carroll Shelby's venomous street terrors, but most Cobra IIs came with a 2.8-liter Cologne V6 making barely over 100 horsepower. The optional 3.2 V8, once the heartbeat of real American muscle, was now a smog-choked lump producing a laughable 134 HP. It groaned under acceleration, wheezed in the passing lane, and rarely lived up to the fire-breathing image it projected. Quarter-mile times hovered in the 17-18-second range. From a stoplight, it could lose to a minivan. It was all roar, no teeth. But performance was only part of the deception. The greater concern, in the darker legacy, was its structural integrity. Underneath the Mustang II was a modified Pinto platform, and with it came many of the same problems that would later tarnish that infamous name. The Pinto, as history infamously recorded, suffered from serious safety flaws, including fuel tank placement and rear impact vulnerabilities. Though the Mustang II was slightly larger and more refined, the core structure remained similar. Crumple zones were primitive or non-existent. The car's nose and tail were designed more for styling than energy absorption. And with the added bulk of cosmetic body kits, fake scoops, and decals, the Cobra II's center of gravity rose while its rigidity remained questionable. In a collision, especially a side or rear impact, the Cobra II often crumpled in the wrong ways, exposing occupants to devastating forces. The doors could twist or jam. The steering column was only partially collapsible. Reinforcement in the AI and B pillars was minimal. And worst of all, the lightweight materials used to keep costs down translated into fragility. This was a car that could be mortally wounded by a mid-speed crash, folding around its occupants like a cheap suit. And it wasn't just theoretical. Numerous crash tests and real-world accidents showed that the Mustang II lacked the backbone of the muscle cars that came before it. It was a shadow of its lineage, a car meant to look like a warrior, but built with the bones of a commuter. Even the suspension, tuned for comfort and fuel economy, betrayed the car's promise of athleticism. It wallowed in corners, leaned like a canoe, and lost grip under pressure. A spirited drive could quickly turn into a white-knuckle experience, not from speed, but from instability. Yet somehow the Cobra II still captured hearts, if only for a brief time. It was the car driven by Farrah Fawcett in Charlie's Angels, a bright white and blue fashion statement on four wheels. It looked sharp in photographs. It made people dream. But for those who expected performance, or worse, safety, it became a bitter lesson in disappointment. It wasn't fast, it wasn't safe, and it certainly wasn't a Cobra. Today, the '76 Cobra II is both a curiosity and a cautionary tale. Enthusiasts may treasure it for its campy charm, its disco-era boldness, and its undeniable presence. But no one mistakes it for a serious performance car anymore. It lives on as a plastic-suited imposter, a reminder of what happens when the badge outpaces the engineering, and when style is asked to cover for substance that simply isn't there. It wasn't a muscle car, it wasn't a sports car, and in many ways it wasn't even a safe car. It was an illusion, fast-looking, slow-moving, and dangerously fragile. A Cobra in name only, and in the real world, far more likely to bite its owner than the road. The 1964 Ford Galaxie 500XL 427 lightweight was a monster in a gentleman's suit, a full-size street machine disguised as a showroom family sedan, but bred in secrecy to annihilate anything on the drag strip. It wasn't built for comfort. It wasn't built for refinement. It was built for one thing and one thing only: to win. Win at the lights, win on the quarter mile, and crush the competition under the brutal mechanical authority of 425 horses and a ton of aluminum fury. But as a street car, as a daily driver, it was an unfiltered, barely street-legal death wish on wheels. Ford created the Galaxie lightweight during a time when the big three were locked in a blood feud for quarter-mile dominance. GM had its factory Chevelle Z11s, and Mopar was gearing up with Max wedges and Hemis. Ford, determined not to be left in the dust, launched a factory drag car that looked like a standard Galaxie 500XL from 20 feet away, but was anything but ordinary. It started with weight, or more precisely, the lack of it. Out went the heavy steel front fenders, hood, and bumpers. In came aluminum and fiberglass, brittle, thin, and light as possible. Even the frame was tweaked to shed pounds. Inside, Ford ripped out anything that wasn't necessary for forward motion. No heater, no radio, no insulation. Just thin door panels, a metal dash, and bare-bones bucket seats. The sound of that big block wasn't muted. It howled, echoing through an unpadded shell that felt more like a tin can filled with gunpowder. And then came the engine. Ford's fearsome 427 cubic inch big block, officially rated at 425 HP, but known to produce even more in reality. Dual 4-barrel Holley carburetors, a high-lift solid lifter camshaft, headers that dump a power into the street like a thunderclap. The car could run high 11s in the quarter mile with slicks and tuning, which in '64 made it absolutely volcanic. Even stock with skinny bias-ply tires, it was a handful. Drop the clutch too hard, and you weren't going forward. You were going sideways, frying rubber and clawing for traction like a cornered animal. Now imagine that on a public road. This was a car that did not want to be driven gently. Its power band was abrupt, its idle was rough, and its torque came on like a freight train. The factory manual transmission could be swapped for a 4-speed top-loader, but no matter how good your shifts were, the car punished anyone who dared treat it casually. The suspension? Still basically that of a full-size Ford, soft, boat-like, with a live rear axle and coil springs that weren't prepared to handle the chaos being unleashed under full throttle. And the brakes? Ah, yes, in an era before disc brakes became standard, the Galaxie lightweight came with big drum brakes all around. Yes, the same kind of technology you'd find on a pickup truck or base sedan, and completely overwhelmed by the kind of speeds this car could generate. After one hard pass, they'd fade like a memory. After two, you were relying on downshifts and prayer. The pedal got mushy, the stopping distance got worse, and the whole car felt like it was teetering on the edge of control. There were no crumple zones, no three-point seat belts, no energy-absorbing steering column. If you hit something, you hit it with all 3,300 pounds of Detroit steel and aluminum, and your body absorbed the rest. The thin fiberglass hood would shatter, the fenders would crumple awkwardly, and the interior provided no real protection. It was a bullet with bad aim. At full tilt, it was a thrill. In an accident, it was a tomb. Yet for a certain kind of driver, that danger was part of the allure. You weren't supposed to daily this car. You weren't supposed to idle through traffic or drop the kids off at school. You bought a 1964 Galaxie 500 XL 427 lightweight if you were serious, if you had a trailer, if you had drag slicks in the trunk and your name etched on a timing board somewhere. This was a machine that separated amateurs from warriors, violently and sometimes tragically. Today, these cars are holy grails for collectors. Only a handful were built. Estimates suggest as few as 50 full lightweight cars, maybe fewer, with the full aluminum treatment in all performance options. They command six figures now, when they even surface at all. But they remain a haunting reminder of just how far automakers were willing to go to win, and just how far they were willing to push the limits of street legality in pursuit of speed. The 1964 Galaxie 500 XL 427 lightweight wasn't just unsafe, it was unapologetically unsafe. It was an instrument of war in a world of civilians, a race car masquerading as a full-size Ford. And if you had the guts to drive one on the street, you had to make peace with the fact that you were gambling with every squeeze of the throttle. Because in that car, at that time, there were only two outcomes: glory or wreckage. The 1984 Ford Bronco II is remembered today not as a triumph of design or utility, but as a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when marketing outpaces engineering, and when the thirst for profit outstrips the responsibility of safety. On paper, it sounded like a perfect idea, a compact, nimble SUV designed for the adventurous American who wanted off-road style and utility in a smaller, more fuel-efficient package. It was Ford's answer to the Chevrolet S10 Blazer, a new player in a fast-growing market. But under that rugged exterior and all those magazine-ready ads showing it crawling over rocks and splashing through streams, the Bronco II carried with it an invisible threat, one that would ultimately cost hundreds of lives, spark a tidal wave of lawsuits, and cast a long, dark shadow over Ford's SUV legacy. At the heart of the problem was its platform. The Bronco II was based on the compact Ford Ranger pickup, but with a wheelbase that had been chopped down, creating a stubby, narrow vehicle with a high center of gravity and a tendency to tip. It sat tall but rode narrow. Add in soft suspension, vague and unpredictable steering, and the kind of short wheelbase that magnified every bump and twitch in the road, and you had a recipe not for stability, but for disaster. On dry pavement, in calm conditions, the Bronco II could feel fine, even composed. But the moment something went wrong, a swerve to avoid a deer, a sharp turn on a wet road, a panic maneuver at highway speed, it could betray you. The suspension would load unevenly, the tires would dig in, and in the blink of an eye, the whole vehicle could lift and roll. And once it began to tip, there was little you could do to stop it. Crash tests revealed a troubling reality. The Bronco II was startlingly prone to rollover, even in moderate handling scenarios. It didn't take a high-speed collision to flip it. Sometimes all it took was a quick lane change. And when it rolled hard, with a narrow roofline and weak structural support that often collapsed inward, leading to serious or fatal injuries for occupants, especially those not wearing seatbelts. By the early 1990s, the numbers began to tell a grim story. Over 200 fatalities were directly linked to rollover incidents involving the Bronco II. Lawsuits began to pile up, hundreds of them, with damning evidence that Ford had known about the vehicle's instability even during its development phase. Internal documents later revealed that Ford engineers had raised concerns about the Bronco II's high rollover risk long before it ever hit showroom floors. But the decision was made to push forward. The market was hot, the competition was fierce, and the bottom line demanded action. To Ford's credit, they made running changes over the years. Wider axles, suspension tweaks, slight geometry adjustments, but none of it was enough to erase the Bronco II's core flaw. It was inherently unstable, and no Band-Aid would make it safe. Even more damning was the fact that Ford continued to market the vehicle aggressively to families and outdoor enthusiasts, never warning them of its very real dangers. Eventually, by 1990, the Bronco II was pulled from production and replaced by the Explorer, itself a safer, more refined vehicle that would go on to achieve massive success. But the damage was done. By the late 90s, Ford had paid out more than $2 billion in legal settlements and damages related to Bronco II rollover accidents. The vehicle's reputation was shattered. For many, it was no longer just a flawed SUV. It was a symbol of corporate negligence, a reminder of what happens when image triumphs over integrity. And yet, you can still find Bronco IIs today, rusting quietly behind barns, lovingly restored by off-road enthusiasts, or parked in garages by owners who still swear by their rugged charm. To some, they are misunderstood classics. But to others, to the families of those who never walked away from a rollover, the Bronco II is a ghost that never stops haunting. It looked like a tool for freedom. In truth, it was a trap. Compact, capable, and affordable. Yes, but dangerously unstable and unforgiving when pushed. The 1984 Bronco II may have helped define the early SUV market, but it did so with a price far greater than dollars. It became, in the end, a lesson written in steel and sorrow, that no adventure is worth chasing in a machine that can't keep its wheels on the ground. The 1973 Ford Country Squire wagon was the ultimate vision of American suburban bliss on four wheels. A rolling living room with wood-grain decals, bench seats like sofas, and enough chrome to blind oncoming traffic. It was the vehicle of choice for family road trips, PTA meetings, and highway vacations that stretched across hundreds of miles. This car wasn't just transportation. It was a cultural icon, a steel and glass monument to America's obsession with space, size, and style. But beneath its placid, family-friendly veneer lurked a set of engineering compromises and outright dangers that turned this automotive leviathan into a lurking hazard, especially from behind. At nearly 19 feet long and weighing in at over 4,700 pounds, the 73 Country Squire was no lightweight. It was built for comfort, not maneuverability, and its sheer bulk made it an intimidating presence on the road. But the most notorious hazard wasn't under the hood or in the suspension, it was in the tailgate, or more specifically, the tailgate window. Ford offered an electric rear window as an option for convenience. At first glance, it seemed like a thoughtful feature. After all, the back of the Country Squire functioned like a Swiss Army knife. The tailgate could swing down like a truck bed or open sideways like a door. The power window was there to give families easy access to the cavernous cargo area without needing to open the entire rear gate. But in reality, this system was plagued with trouble. The electric motor and the wiring behind it were temperamental at best, and at worst, actively dangerous. Over time, especially in hot climates or after years of use, the electrical system that controlled the tailgate window would wear out, corrode, or short circuit. In some cases, pressure would build in the sealed tailgate area when the window was closed too tightly or became stuck halfway. Then came the moment of surprise. A pop, a shatter, and a shower of tempered glass exploding inward or outward, often without warning. Owners describe moments of confusion, panic, and minor injuries. One minute you were loading groceries or reaching in for a diaper bag, and the next you were dodging shards of flying glass. And since this was the 70s, there were no sensors, safety cutoffs, or redundant protection systems. It was raw current in thin glass, and sometimes it turned volatile. But the risks didn't end there. Because of its long overhang and massive rearward cargo area, the Country Squire had a significant rear weight bias, especially when loaded with luggage or passengers in the rear-facing third-row seat. A family favorite that placed kids facing directly out the back window, often with little more than a lap belt and a wide-eyed view of the road behind them. In an era before crash testing was sophisticated or crash zones were designed, the Squire offered precious little rear impact protection. A fender bender from behind, at even moderate speeds, could buckle the tailgate inward, right where those kids were sitting. Add the potential of a shattering window during such a crash, and suddenly that idyllic Sunday drive had turned into a high-speed, glass-blown nightmare. Handling was no savings race either. With a floaty suspension designed to glide over potholes and undulations like a waterbed on wheels, the '73 Country Squire suffered from vague steering, delayed response, and brutal understeer. Emergency maneuvers were sluggish and unpredictable, especially when the car was weighed down in the back. Braking distance was long, body roll was immense. You didn't drive a Country Squire, you piloted it like an ocean liner changing course with a prayer and a firm grip on the wheel. And in terms of safety equipment, this was the early '70s, before airbags, before crumple zones were properly engineered, and before reinforced roof pillars were standard. The Country Squire was essentially a giant steel box, which meant that in a crash, the energy of the impact traveled through the car like a tuning fork, shaking and crumpling with little regard for passenger safety. Seatbelts were lap style and optional. The dashboard? A hard slab of unforgiving plastic and chrome. The steering column? Non-collapsible and capable of impaling the driver in the worst crashes. So what you had was a perfect storm. A family car with a fragile, electrically faulty rear window that could explode unexpectedly. A vulnerable tailgate packed with children sitting inches from a potential impact zone, and a weight distribution that made evasive maneuvers nearly impossible. Combine all that with outdated safety design and 1970s-era crashworthiness, and the '73 Country Squire stopped looking like a rolling vacation and started looking like a liability with wood paneling. And yet, people loved them. They filled suburban driveways, anchored family photos, and served as the backdrop to millions of American memories. They were dependable, familiar. The 1969 Ford Mustang Mach I 428 Cobra Jet stands as a thunderous icon of muscle car history, a mechanical titan from an era when raw power was the ultimate currency and driver aids were non-existent luxuries. It wasn't just a car, it was a challenge, a wild stallion that demanded skill, respect, and absolute attention from the driver. Beneath the bold, aggressive lines and iconic Mach 1 stripes roared the 428 Cobra Jet, an engine that didn't whisper but screamed torque and horsepower with brutal force, shaking the very ground beneath its tires. This was a time before traction control, anti-lock brakes, electronic stability programs, or any of the modern gizmos we take for granted today. The Mach 1 428 Cobra Jet came with pure, unfiltered mechanical power sent straight to the rear wheels, with no safety nets or digital babysitters to intervene. The powertrain was a beast with over 335 horsepower and an enormous torque curve that kicked like a wild mule. The throttle was like a trigger with no moderation. A light tap could spin those skinny, bias-ply tires instantly. The raw responsiveness meant the car could surge forward with explosive force, and just as quickly throw the rear end out of line if the driver wasn't laser-focused. For a seasoned driver who knew how to read the car's moods, the Mach 1 was an intoxicating thrill, a car that communicated every pulse of power, every vibration through the steering wheel, every quiver in the chassis. It was a visceral experience, a direct connection between man and machine that's nearly impossible to replicate in modern, computer-controlled vehicles. But for anyone lacking experience or respect for that explosive potential, the 428 Cobra Jet was more than just a handful. It was a dangerous beast waiting to be unleashed. One of the greatest threats was the absence of any traction control system. The rear wheels were tasked with handling all that power, and if the tires lost grip, whether launching from a stop, cornering hard, or applying throttle mid-turn, the car could suddenly oversteer with frightening abruptness. That snap oversteer was a nightmare for drivers caught off guard, turning confident acceleration into a perilous spin. The light steering, narrow tires, and stiff suspension only amplified this. It was the kind of car where mistakes were punished instantly and harshly. Wet weather was especially treacherous. The era's bias-ply tires were nowhere near as grippy as today's radials, and on rain-slicked pavement, the Mach 1 became little more than a rocket-powered sled with no brakes. The tires struggled to hold traction under even gentle throttle, making corner exits a perilous gamble. Braking was a struggle as well, Many 69 Mach 1s were still equipped with drum brakes, which could fade quickly under stress. Without anti-lock braking systems, locking up the wheels during emergency stops was common, often leading to loss of control or extended stopping distances. The car's heavy front end and aggressive power made it harder to modulate brakes smoothly, especially for the inexperienced. Inside the cockpit, the experience was far from cushy or forgiving. Steering was manual or only lightly assisted, requiring muscle and precision to navigate. The suspension was designed for performance, but by modern standards it was harsh and unforgiving, transferring every road imperfection into the driver's hands. The Mach 1 wasn't meant for lazy Sunday cruises or timid drivers. It was built for those who craved adrenaline and could handle its ferocity. Safety equipment? Minimal. Seatbelts were basic lap belts, airbags were decades away, and the interior was lined with hard surfaces and sharp edges. The rigid frame and muscle car chassis focused on straight-line speed, not crash energy absorption or occupant protection. The car was a roaring beast, and you were the one responsible for keeping it tame. The 1900 Mustang Mach 1 428 Cobra jet captured the spirit of an era where horsepower ruled supreme and safety was often an afterthought. It was a machine that required respect, understanding, and skill, without which it could quickly turn from thrilling to terrifying. Its legendary status is well-earned, but the truth remains, it was a terrifying street beast. A rocket-powered machine with no electronic guardrails, where one misstep could send you spinning out of control. Today, enthusiasts revere it for its raw power and iconic styling, accepting the risks as part of the legend. But behind every roaring exhaust note lies the sobering reality that the 1969 Mach 1 428 Cobra jet was as much a test of a driver's nerve and skill as it was a showcase of Ford's muscle car prowess. It wasn't built for safety or ease. It was built for adrenaline, power, and pure, unfiltered speed. And in that era, sometimes that meant the line between glory and disaster was razor thin. The 1971 Ford Pinto is one of the most infamous cautionary tales in automotive history, a symbol not only of flawed engineering, but of a corporate culture that, at its worst, prioritized profits over human lives. It's impossible to compile any list of dangerously designed or ethically questionable cars without the Pinto looming large, a compact vehicle whose rear-mounted fuel tank design would come to define one of the most notorious safety scandals ever faced by an automaker. Ford intended the Pinto to be a nimble, affordable response to the growing demand for small, fuel-efficient cars during the early 1970s fuel crisis. It was a chance for Ford to compete in a rapidly shifting market dominated by imports. But this rush to capture market share resulted in critical compromises. At the heart of the Pinto's design was a fatal flaw. The fuel tank was positioned behind the rear axle, extremely close to the rear bumper, with only a thin sheet of metal separating it from potential impact in a rear-end collision. While this placement helped keep the car compact and lightweight, it also exposed the fuel tank to crushing and puncturing even in relatively low-speed collisions, events that were common and often minor in other cars. Crash tests showed that when struck from behind, the fuel tank could rupture, leaking gasoline that would ignite in sparks generated by the impact, causing catastrophic fires and explosions. This wasn't a hypothetical risk, it was a predictable and proven danger. Despite early knowledge of this problem, internal Ford documents later revealed a disturbing truth. Ford had conducted a cost-benefit analysis and decided it would be cheaper to pay out damages and lawsuits from burn injuries and deaths than to redesign the fuel system or reinforce the tank area. The infamous memo estimated that it would cost about $11 per vehicle to fix the tank issue, but that settling potential lawsuits from accidents was projected to be less expensive. This cold calculation exposed a chilling ethical failure. Lives were reduced to dollar signs, and warnings from engineers were sidelined. The human toll was tragic. Numerous accidents involving the Pinto's rear fuel tank ruptures led to deadly fires that engulfed the vehicle and trapped occupants. Victims often suffered horrific burns, with rescue efforts hampered by the rapid spread of flames. Estimates suggest that dozens of deaths were directly caused by this design defect. though exact numbers vary due to underreporting and the passage of time. Families were devastated, lawsuits piled up, and public outrage grew as the scandal unfolded. The Pinto case became a watershed moment in automotive safety and corporate responsibility. It drew intense media attention in congressional hearings that exposed Ford's internal decision-making and highlighted broader issues with safety regulations at the time. It was a scandal that rocked not just Ford but the entire industry, helping spur reforms in safety standards, crash testing, and regulatory oversight. Technically, the Pinto's fuel tank placement was a glaring design error. Unlike other vehicles that located fuel tanks away from potential impact zones, often behind the rear axle or in protected cavities, the Pinto's tank was effectively a sitting duck. The thin metal shield in the design of the rear bumper offered negligible protection in crashes. Compounding the danger was the use of materials and engineering practices that failed to anticipate or adequately guard against the forces involved in rear collisions. Even after the danger became widely known and Ford issued recalls, many Pintos remained on the road for years, putting drivers and passengers at risk. Owners of the Pinto often described a lingering unease knowing their car had such a hazardous flaw. The car itself, once marketed as a practical, economical solution, became a symbol of corporate negligence and a bitter reminder of the consequences of rushing products to market without adequate safety considerations. From a cultural standpoint, the Pinto scandal changed the way the public viewed automakers. No longer was the car simply a machine or status symbol. It was also a product that carried inherent risks, and the manufacturers had a moral and legal obligation to protect buyers from foreseeable harm. The scandal fueled demands for stricter government safety regulations, better crash testing procedures, and greater transparency from automakers. Today, the 1971 Ford Pinto stands as a sobering lesson in automotive history. It's not remembered for innovation or style, but as one of the most dangerous and ethically disastrous cars ever produced by Ford, a stark example of how cost-cutting and poor corporate decisions can lead to tragedy. It remains a haunting reminder of an era when safety was often sacrificed on the altar of profit and the devastating real-world consequences that followed. The 1960 Ford Falcon occupies a curious and ultimately troubling place in the annals of American automotive history. A car that promised affordable, practical transportation for the burgeoning post-war middle class, yet simultaneously offered a glaring example of just how dangerously half-hearted early safety efforts could be. At a time when public awareness of automotive safety was only beginning to rise, Ford took a puzzling and ethically questionable approach by allowing buyers to opt out entirely of essential safety features bundled in its so-called Lifeguard safety package. This wasn't a mere marketing quirk. It was a profound statement about how automakers weighed cost, convenience, and consumer choice against the fundamental human need for protection on the road. The Lifeguard package, introduced in the late 1950s and carried into the early 1960s, was Ford's tentative foray into the emerging field of automotive safety. It included innovations that today seem basic: padded dashboards designed to cushion the inevitable impact of a driver or passenger's head during a crash, recessed instrument panels intended to reduce the risk of impalement from sharp metal edges, and seatbelts, which were still not standard equipment. Industry-wide, these features represented a significant step forward in protecting occupants. But Ford's decision to make these features optional, and even worse, to offer a delete option that allowed customers to skip them entirely, sent a dangerous message. Survival, it seemed, was up for negotiation, a luxury that could be turned off to save a few dollars. The Falcon itself was designed as Ford's compact answer to the growing demand for smaller, more economical cars during an era when fuel efficiency and affordability were becoming paramount. It was marketed as a practical family vehicle, light, nimble, and accessible to a new generation of drivers looking for reliable transportation without the bulk or cost of full-size cars. However, beneath this approachable exterior lurked a machine that was, by modern standards, dangerously ill-prepared to protect its occupants in even moderate collisions. Structurally, the Falcon was built with wafer-thin steel panels that lacked the reinforcement or energy-absorbing features we now associate with vehicle safety. In a crash, instead of absorbing or dissipating impact forces, the Falcon's body would transfer violent shocks directly to the occupants. Unlike vehicles engineered with crumple zones designed to deform progressively and absorb energy, the Falcon's rigid frame and thin body panels offered little resistance to deformation, but also little protection. Occupants could find themselves subject to brutal forces with nowhere for that energy to go. Perhaps most alarming was the design of the Falcon's steering column, which by 1960 standards was outdated and unforgiving. Instead of a collapsible column engineered to absorb energy and collapse away from the driver during a frontal crash, the Falcon featured a rigid, non-collapsible steering column positioned so that in the event of a collision, it could act like a dangerous spear. Drivers risked being impaled or severely injured by the very mechanism intended to steer the vehicle, a horrifying irony that magnified the car's risk in accidents. This was a flaw that would take years and public pressure before widespread adoption of collapsible columns became standard in the industry. Adding to the danger, many buyers chose to forgo the lifeguard package altogether, tempted by a lower sticker price or unaware of the grave consequences. Without seatbelts, padded interiors, or even basic safety reinforcements, these Falcons were little more than metal shells, cheap, yes, but perilously inadequate. It was a cruel bargain, a car that promised to be your family's trusted transport, but which offered only the thinnest veil of protection against injury or death in a crash. Ford's willingness to allow deletion of such vital safety features reflects a broader cultural and industry mindset of the time. Safety was not yet fully embraced as a non-negotiable standard, but was instead a topic of debate, optional extras, and cost-benefit analyses. Regulators were still developing standards, and the general public was just awakening to the importance of safety features. In this context, Ford's lifeguard deletion option exemplifies how economic pressures and competitive market forces often won out over the moral imperative to protect human lives. As crashes and injury reports mounted, the thin margin of safety offered by the Falcon became a harsh reality for many families. The car's structure and safety shortcomings contributed to serious injuries and fatalities that might have been avoided with more robust design and mandatory safety equipment. Though the Falcon played an important role in bringing affordable, practical transportation to millions, it did so with a risk profile that would be considered reckless.